Welcome to Socializing Security, where every week we have a discussion about security, compliance, and beyond.
Our goal is to learn and grow by socializing each week's topic with each other, our guests, and with you.
A quick compliance note, this podcast is meant for informational purposes only and should not be considered legal or regulatory advice.
We're glad you've joined us, and we hope you'll learn along with us.
And we're back with another episode of Socializing Security. Today we're going to be talking about trusting retailers and how, especially if you ever have found that one thing on the internet that you're like, I really want this, but I'm not sure if this is a trusted site, and how do I figure that out, and how do I protect myself to purchase that coveted thing that I can't get on my usual retailers. That's really what we're hoping to talk about today. Brian, have you ever purchased some of those things? I'm not sure. I feel like you're more risk averse than I am.
I have very, 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 very cautiously, much of which is going to come out in this episode. But occasionally there are things that you just need to get because sometimes it's so much cheaper to buy it from a manufacturer directly. Sometimes you have ethical issues with the really big retailers. Sometimes it's just the perfect thing. Just that thing that you need is great there. That I do consider it. I do think about it. And we'll talk about some of the things that I do in those situations in order to try to protect myself, because I am always very, very wary about those things. But also keeping in mind that sometimes the big established ones have issues as well, that need to be concerned about. One example I'll give that I've heard recently that's kind of old news is there's a website called Newegg that a lot of IT people will know because it's pretty popular for buying computer components. And I heard recently, and I don't remember all the details of it exactly, but they had some fishy stuff they were doing on the back end with their data that I didn't learn about until recently. So even sometimes the more established sites you got to be careful with. And, sometimes I go in and out as to whether I want to always trust the big name retailers to do everything for me versus spread it out so no one site knows everything about me. I guess it's a little bit of hedging my bet around data leakage and somebody being able to know everything that I buy.
You've also heard us say this before, pretty much on many of our episodes, of saying like, hey, if there's one thing you want to do for data hygiene today, right, is like go through your Amazon account and clear out some of the data that you have that, like old addresses and stuff like that they don't need to have. And then obviously we like to play the game of how little data can you give?
Yeah. So to that end, I kind of talked a little bit about, the calculus, I guess, that I use to decide whether to use site A versus site B to buy a thing. I guess, Milu, what are your thoughts around that as well?
I think it's also just like where I always look for reviews, right? Like if I'm ever going to like a site that I haven't shopped from before, or I'm not totally sure, I always go to like the Better Business Bureau and like look at those reviews. And then I also just like look on Google to figure out like what are people saying. And if I see any reviews, right, where somebody's like, this is a scam, or like I never got what I ordered, then immediately like red flag, and I'm not going to buy it from there. I'd rather spend a little bit extra knowing I'm actually going to get the thing. So I would always say I always look at the website itself, look at, do they have a return policy? Do they have terms of service? Am I getting like a security flag when I just try to access the website, right? Those are all red flags that you as an online consumer should be taking pause to being like, is this really worth sharing my information with this company that I'm not sure they're going to protect it in the same way that a bigger retailer would?
Mm-hmm.
So I feel like reviews are king for that. That's probably the best place to look to. And I feel like if you also don't see any reviews about the company, that's also odd.
Well, and then on that point, one thing to be aware of with a lot of sites, so Amazon, for example, most of the purchases that you make on Amazon these days are not with Amazon. Amazon's just a broker to it. Think of it like a consignment shop. If you're talking old school storefronts, where one person may be running the facility. A lot of antique stores are this way too, but every piece that you would buy in there is directly from somebody else, from a third party in that regard. So that makes it even more difficult because then you got to consider, okay, who's going to get my information? Who's going to know what's going on there? It becomes I'm not necessarily sharing everything with just Amazon, because that third party seller has to at least have my address because they got to ship the thing to me. Now Amazon's a unique one a little bit just because they not only broker the sale, but they also broker um, the logistics aspect of it in a lot of cases too. So they sell that to sellers to say, we'll host, you send the materials to us and we'll put it in our warehouses and we'll ship it from our warehouses. So there's a level of separation there, but sites that I've used in the past forever moved to more of that kind of model. And some of them didn't move it to the point where Amazon is, where it's, the end sellers would see all the information I would have. So yeah, it's complex there, but typical security measures of making sure that the site's secure and making sure that you understand the terms of service and things that are going on there, at least enough to make yourself comfortable, are important.
Yeah, then how do you pay for the thing?
Yeah, well, I'm one to not give up my credit card unless I have to, or if it's a site I really, really trust. So sites like the airlines that I use on a regular basis have my credit card because the convenience factor is just too much there. Um, Amazon, I give my credit card directly. A lot of random sites that I don't go to on a regular basis, I will use something like PayPal or Google Pay, just to put a little bit of I guess, a firewall and obfuscation in there, where that site is now dealing with PayPal or Google or Apple to arrange the payment. They're not getting my direct credit card number. Um, of course, if I'm going to buy something online, I'm never going to use a debit card. That's a very big no-no. Don't do that. In fact, I
Why is
almost
that?
never. Debit cards don't have as much protections around them. So if you ever had that, oh, I got a fraudulent card on my credit card, you call a credit card company and they fairly quickly eliminate that and then send you a new card with a new number. You don't get that with a debit card. The thing I told my kids when they got their ATM/debit cards, I would also give them a credit card, because it became this is for the ATM and absolute emergencies. And other than that, you really want to use your credit card. Um, they didn't always follow that because they wanted to use it more like cash. But it is more like cash because it is taking directly out of your checking, savings account, whatever that debit card's connected to, and you may not have any recourse to get it back.
Yeah, the fraud prevention is huge too, right? Like if something goes wrong with the card, or potentially if you never get the thing that you paid for, if it just like never arrives, right? You can still potentially contest it with your credit card company and potentially recoup that cost. And you at least have like some better buy-in. I do also think the suggestion too, especially if you're working with retailers that you don't shop with as often, I think using Apple or Google Pay or PayPal is a really great way to protect your information, because ultimately, they're a payment processor. They're still getting paid. They just don't need your actual credit card number, which is
Yeah.
great. So they're just getting the funds, they're seeing the transaction, but they won't actually see the card data. So that's definitely a really great way to protect yourself.
Yeah. I then have concerns with PayPal and other processors like that, again, they're seeing a complete inventory of everything that I'm doing. I don't know if I'm always comfortable with that. I tell myself that I'm being paranoid sometimes with that. And again, everything's a trade-off. So I would rather PayPal know kind of all of my purchases than random site having my credit card number. And who knows what they're doing with that? And who knows if they're protecting it well enough? Are they storing it? They shouldn't be. PCI should come into play there, but you just don't know. And once you've given it over, you've lost control of it.
Yeah. Yeah, usually you'll know after the fact when your card has potentially been exposed and you're getting fraud alerts. Um,
Yeah,
yeah.
which is never a fun experience. Best case scenario is they just use it to buy a bunch of stuff and that triggers the alert. Um, I know I've had several times. They've done a lot better over the last, I'd say, 5, 6 years of blocking transactions that look fraudulent, patterns that you normally don't have. Like if somebody went out and bought $500 worth of sneakers at a Nike store, that would probably trigger something for my credit card because that's not something I would have ever done. So I'm sure a lot of you have probably had the experience of credit card being declined when you're sitting there buying something at a physical store that you've not normally had, or even a virtual store. Um, Oddly, it happens to me more in the physical store, maybe because I buy so much stuff online, um, where it says, "Oh, well, I can't process the transaction for some reason." Then you immediately get an alert on your phone, and then you get a text message, and then your spouse gets one too because you share a credit card. It's like all the alerts are going off at the same time, mainly because they're like, "Hey, did you make this transaction?" And then you've got to reprocess that transaction. So that stuff is good. I don't know that banks have implemented that level of protection around debit cards on the front end, which I really, really, really like. It's inconvenient at the moment when you're checking out at a grocery store in a town that you've never been to before, which is the first time I had to deal with that. I thought for sure my credit card had been shut down and somebody had taken it over and all sorts of horrible stuff that was going to ruin the vacation. It turned out it was just it was just a fraud prevention measure that they had implemented. So yeah, so just picking the right payment solution to protect yourself is an important thing for me. Um, we've talked a little bit about the data aspect of things, credit card obviously being one aspect of it, your address being another one. Um, I know you talked about playing the how little data can you give aspect of things. I guess how does that play into your decision around these types of things?
I think it's tricky, right? Because for the most part, if you're purchasing goods online, you're definitely going to have to give your name, your email address, your home address, which you theoretically, I guess, could use a PO box if you
Mm-hmm.
wanted to be really privacy minded and not, or just like a UPS locker or something like that if you don't want to give your home address. But it's hard to play the game of how little data do I give them because most of it's required.
Mm-hmm.
So it's hard when you're purchasing goods because you can't buy the thing without giving that information up. So I do think there's things like, you can check out it as a guest if you want. It does mean like I guess you might not get as bad like the best order tracking, or if you need a refund, it might be like a return, it might be a little bit harder. But I do think, if you don't need to create an account, I guess the question is like, why am I doing this in the first place? Especially if it's a retailer that you haven't used before and you might, it's like a one-off purchase. I wouldn't create an account. There's no reason for them to have that information about you.
Yeah.
So I think it's being mindful of, do I even need this online account? And then again, looking like, what information do they actually need? They shouldn't need your birth date. I feel like they still ask that for like a coupon maybe for your birthday month, but like most of us don't need that. So like avoid giving that information if you can, and then trying your best to only give the required fields.
Yeah, two things that I really like that you said. One is creating the account aspect of things is always it's one that I always spend a lot of time thinking about, to be honest, because there are a lot of conveniences that come from that. I've been known to go back and, okay, what was that thing that I ordered? Rather than going and grabbing the thing and looking at a model number or whatever that might be, I'll just log in because I'm already sitting in front of my computer. And this is one of those places where buying from the same retailer over and over again really pays off, is having that list of things. You know when you bought it, you know what you bought. Whereas a random site where you buy it, you may not have that level of recallability of it unless you save an email or something. Um, I've been known to wait to buy two or three times from a site and then feel like, yeah, this is probably going to continue happening. Let's go ahead and create an account. Because yeah, that just gives them more trackability. It's like opening up that grocery saver card where you open up an account and now you can get a discount because you keep using your card. Well, guess what? They're using that to track what you buy and the patterns in which you buy. And maybe they tie that directly to you, maybe they don't. But it is data collection that's going on there. So I usually avoid that unless it's significant discounts. Unfortunately, the grocery stores are making that very, very appealing these days. The birth date one is an interesting one because with travel, I go to coffee shops all over the place, and I'm usually looking at what kind of payment system they have. Most of them are moving to Square and the others like that. So I'm usually fairly comfortable with those systems because they're well known. They're usually fairly obvious. And the downside of those become the fact that, they track your credit card, and whether you create an account with Square or not, that whole, okay, well, you'll get an email with your receipt is awesome for people like me who have to do expense reports. But it's also scary for people like me who care about privacy and security, because now I know that they're tracking everything I buy directly to my email address, which is pretty much the keys to the kingdom at that point. And so there's another balance on that front. The one that always freaks me out the most, and I just had this with my last trip, was get an email a day later. Hey, we'd love to celebrate your birthday. And then we get to that point that you made, which is, don't give up your birthday. That is an important piece of information that can be used, just like your social security number to some extent. My family has a tendency to get a lot of, here's your happy birthday coupon on January 1st, because that's the date I oftentimes will throw in there just to make it pretty obvious that you're not getting my real birthday. Because if that's all it is about, is getting me a discount on my birthday, then fine. Let's celebrate the new year together rather than my actual birth.
It's clever. Yeah, I do think also there's something to be said about, there's also tools, right? That now there's also like alternative identity tools that you can use. Like Surfshark is one that I'm familiar with, where you can basically have like a fake online persona, and that's what you can use to actually like put in your information, and it'll still route through that provider to actually make sure that you get what you need. It's another option to potentially obscure your information, especially I think if you're working with lesser known sites that maybe are like, yeah, I do basically want to check out as Jane Doe, and I just want to be able to get this thing. Again, we had mentioned PO boxes is another way to protect your information if you're not sure that you can set that up relatively easily with like a mail service and get packages delivered to the PO box instead of to your personal address. If you don't want that information out there.
Yeah. And that, there's a cost associated with that usually, to be able to, especially if you're talking packages as opposed to just letters. But it could be money well spent if you really want to hide your home address. For most of us, that cat's out of the bag, and it is what it is. Is kind of the point I'm at. Unless I do some really significant scrubbing of my data on person information sites, I know that address is out there. Been at the same address for a while. If I ever move, then I'll probably start thinking about doing that kind of thing and trying to scrub that and maybe hide my actual address going forward. But I don't know that that's really too possible at this point.
It's so hard too, because I feel like there's so much information that is already just out there that because our data has been breached by hundreds of companies at this point, that information is already just like publicly available, or at least is hard to find. Or
Yeah.
sorry, not hard to find. I feel like that information is usually pretty easy to find on the internet. If I went and probably searched, I could probably figure out where you live, which is terrifying. No, it is. That is like scary information, but
Oh,
it's
trust
also,
me, I know.
but it's also like there's also certain things that we've also just like, because we've shared a lot of information with companies, and then unfortunately they have had data breaches. It's just like kind of inevitable that it's floating around there, which is not great. Which is, again, why it is worth being mindful, especially if you're using a retailer that is not a large one and not one that you've shopped with regularly, that you don't have that inherent trust that they're going to keep your information safe. I would really play the game of how little information can I give them, and consider really, again, like, is this really worth my information? Is it worth the couple dollars that I'm going to be saving instead of purchasing it with one of the larger retailers just because they already have my information? And considering like minimizing your digital footprint.
And we talked about this when we talked about 23andMe. Some of your most personal information is your genetic code, and a lot of people have given that up, and that now is floating around the dark web for anybody to use. So even the most trustworthy sites, you've got to consider, is it worth giving up that information? Because that potential does exist out there. And then you start talking mergers, acquisitions. Sometimes companies get bought by foreign companies. I've had a site that I used early on before Amazon was as ubiquitous as it is now. I was a pretty loyal customer of theirs, and one day they got rebranded with a name. I'm like, that doesn't sound like a US based company. And sure enough, I dug into it, and it turned out that they'd gotten acquired. And it's like, yeah, maybe I won't use this site anymore. Even though they've got my information, they don't need to keep getting my information. That's a little bit of where I get into do they need all of the information, or do I spread it around so that, a data breach isn't everything? Okay. So let's say you do decide to purchase from that site and you're happy with the purchase, you get the thing, and weird things start happening. We talked about getting fraud alerts with your credit card. We've talked about the potential for people using your credit card and draining your debit card, whatever that might be. What are the things people should look out for that are warning signs that may not be straight up your credit card's been it's been deactivated because of the fact that we think there's fraud on here? What other things should people look out for there?
You obviously want to make sure that you're not getting like recurring charges or anything like that from this particular retailer or that site. I think that's like an important one. I do think there's something to be said about like turning on alerts on your credit cards for any time your card is pulled, right? So that anytime you are charging something, you're getting an alert on your phone, right? That's like, hey, you spent this amount on this website, or, I think that's important so that people also just have better visibility to make sure. I think also occasionally, you might notice that after you purchase something, suddenly you're on a list, right? And you're suddenly getting like way more spam calls or emails. And so that can be super frustrating because unfortunately, like, there's just not much you can do about that beyond just clicking unsubscribe for every single unsolicited email that you've gotten that's now cluttered your inbox. I think that's a relatively common issue potentially, that if you've purchased something from somewhere new, suddenly you're like, I'm suddenly so an
Yeah.
uptick in contact that I wasn't normally expecting. And you're like, shoot, I think they sold my information, which is really frustrating when that happens. And again, unfortunately, there's really not much you can do instead of being proactive. Every time you can click unsubscribe and you can join do not call lists and stuff like that. But I think just keeping an eye on your credit cards and your email and making sure that things don't look fishy.
PH fishy. Yeah, and that's, anytime all of our information's out there, especially our email addresses, which means we're getting all sorts of spam we don't even see anymore because it's so obvious it gets filtered out. Some of it is much better and escapes through. Sometimes it actually looks legit. Um, you know, if an attacker knows what breach a given email address came from, then they can start crafting it to make it look like, hey, you made this purchase on this site. And now they're starting to craft really good phishing emails that could potentially, hey, buy this extended warranty. That should be a trigger anytime you get an email for an extended warranty. But, something to that effect. Hey, there's this recall, send your item to this address and we'll fix it for you and send it back within a week or whatever. Like those types of things are definitely going to set up warning bells. I definitely have on my credit card, I can't remember what the number is anymore. It's moved a few times, but there's a dollar amount if it's above a dollar amount. So again, I share a credit card with my spouse, and anytime she's goes out and buys something, we had this after having to take our pet to the vet and had a long-term stay, standing out by the car talking to my daughter while she was going in and getting the pet, and my phone goes off and we had this large charge because I want to know, like, it's unusual for us to spend over $1,000, $500, whatever that number is. So I make sure that I know every time that happens. The credit card I share with my kids is much, much, much lower because that's supposed to be emergency use only, and gas and food. And gas and food are not going to charge more than $50, $100, whatever that number is. So yeah, setting those alerts. Of course, if you're really suspicious about something and you're like, I'm really uncomfortable with everything that's going on here, but I need this thing for whatever reason. I've definitely had those. There's a certain thing you have to buy for the kids at school, or there's a thing or that other thing. I will purposely go out and freeze my credit accounts. I may actually use a burner credit card that I hardly ever use. Like I've got a couple credit cards that almost never get used. And so I will use those for those types of things where I'm okay just shutting down the entire account if I need to.
Yeah, and then I do also think too of like protecting your account, especially if you do end up creating an online account for this particular retailer or for an online site, be mindful, don't reuse your credentials. Like use a password manager, be mindful, because if that password gets breached on one site, you are then scrambling to think through to being like, shoot, what other sites did I reuse that password on? And trying to figure that out is nearly impossible. So then you're just kind of hoping for the fact of being like, hope they don't try those credentials at XYZ site.
Yeah.
And access my information. So yeah, I also think just like protecting yourself online. Also, if you are creating an online account, don't reuse your password. Use a password manager. Use like a really complicated password that you don't even remember without using your password manager, right? Be mindful of protecting yourself online because it's helpful. And then that way also, you're making sure that you're not potentially adding to the harm that could happen if your password is leaked somewhere.
Yep. And advantages around being able to change passwords quickly and easily and things like that too come into play.
Yeah, so I think if we kind of just like summarize what we talked about today, when we're thinking about potentially being buyer beware and making sure that we're being mindful, especially if we're sharing information with a new retailer or a new website, be mindful of how little data you can share, only get what's required. Consider using alternative payment. So, there's also virtual cards for credit cards these days so that, they're not the same number. You could do that. You can use Apple Pay, you can use Google Pay, PayPal to take out the credit card data from that retailer. Look up the reviews to make sure you're not seeing like adamant, like this is a scam or this isn't the legit website before you actually commit to buying something. And then make sure that you're being mindful too of like keeping an eye on your credit card transactions so that, you're not seeing something pop up later that wasn't authorized, and get those alerts set up so that, you are aware of what you're spending.
Yep. Totally agree with all those. So hopefully this is helpful. A little bit short episode. But we're trying to give useful information on occasion. So this is a episode that hopefully you can sit down with and maybe change some of your habits to be a little bit more secure and continue the fight for privacy.
Yeah, stay safe online.
Take care, everybody. Thanks for socializing with us. Thank you for joining us for another episode of Socializing Security. We hope you learned a thing or two with us.
If you'd like to continue socializing with us on this topic or have feedback, we'd love to hear from you on LinkedIn or social media. Just search for Socializing Security. Or you can email us at info@socializingsecurity.com.
Until next time, stay social and stay secure.